Hello, my name is Oluritimi Osha. I like to talk about American presidents, and I've been doing a series of videos in honor of Black History Month. Today, I want to talk about the case of uh, Ruby McCollum and the the dreadful Paramour rights in the South. Of course, I've talked earlier about, the law of partus sequitur ventrum, which, which existed, in the antebellum years, and of course, it basically stressed that the children, it was a law that meant that the children of enslaved women were slaves. I've talked about anti-miscegenation laws that started in the 17th century, which prohibited interracial marriage and also prohibited interracial sex. I've done videos now up to the point of Loving versus Virginia, and I recently did a video regarding passing. Uh, you know, and today I want to do a video about Paramour rights. Of course, there was even during the era of slavery and when there were supposed to be strict anti-miscegenation laws, uh, white men exercised Paramour rights. So, of course, white men often coerced sex from black female slaves during the era of slavery, and after that, after slavery was abolished during the Jim Crow era in the South, paramour rights still existed within the 20th century. So paramour rights was basically the the power, the ability of powerful white men to coerce sexual relations from black women, regardless of their social status, and not face legal consequences. So, despite the anti miscegenation laws, and this is what this particular case I want to discuss today, the case of the of McCollum versus the state of Florida of 1954. Um, Ruby McCollum, she was born Ruby Jackson in Florida, and she in 1909 she was a black woman born Ruby Jackson in Florida. She married a man called Sam McCollum in 1931 when she was 22 years old. At some point, she moved to New York, and then she moved back south, and to the area of Fort Myers, where her husband became established. He became a very wealthy owner of enterprises. These gambling enterprises were illegal gambling enterprises, including what were called bolitas. Bolitas were illegal gambling that was very popular amongst the black community. So he also ran. That's her husband, Sam McCullum. He and his brother, they also ran um, illegal liquor sales businesses, right? So bootlegging, of course, this was the era of prohibition, and so they made a lot of money from this. They also owned a farm, right? They owned several farms, not just a farm. They owned the largest farm. They owned a farm with the largest tobacco allotment in Florida. So they had other business enterprises, including burial policies. They sold burial policies, and they owned a funeral home. So they were very, very prosperous. They were so prosperous. I'm going to fast forward up to 1975 after the stories, after the main the crime that centers Ruby McCollum and made her case a landmark case. Fast forward 1975, her son Sam Jr., who at one time had been enrolled at UCLA. In 1975, after the death of his father, he had taken over his father's business. He was arrested. He was imprisoned on 10 counts of gambling, and $250,000 in cash had been confiscated in their at their homestead in Florida, and 250,000 in cash is a lot of money today. It was a lot of money back then. So just to show you how wealthy, uh, you know, Ruby McCollum and her husband were. So they were very prosperous, and this story centers, the 1940s, 1950s. So Ruby McCollum was very prosperous, and she was an upstanding person in the Black community. Of course, this was the era of Jim Crow. So I understand. I've done videos in the past, showing that even during the era of Jim Crow, there were Black people who were involved in mob activities, and they were very prosperous. Right? It was the era of segregation, and so the McCollums were very prosperous, even during the era of segregation, because of the illegal gambling businesses that they ran. Um, Interestingly, though, and she was very respectable, even though they ran these illegal gambling businesses because they made contributions to the church, and so they had this aura of respectability, right? They were like upper class Black people, they were very, very wealthy, right? She was considered the wealthiest woman in Florida. That's Ruby McCollum. Now, the case, however, the what she's notable for is the killing of a senator elect. He was actually a senator elect, and he was a medical doctor, a physician by the name of Leroy Adams, C. Leroy Adams. In August of 1952, she shot and killed him. And she was subsequently arrested, and she was convicted for the killing, and she was sentenced to death through electrocution. However, there was, upon appeal to the Supreme Court of Florida, her conviction was overturned due to a technicality that and including violation of her civil rights. But let me get into the story, how what happened. So I've given the backstory of Ruby McCollum, how she was a prosperous woman. However, she had children with her husband, about three kids with her husband, and then she had one more child, Loretta. Loretta, however, was the child of this white medical doctor, Doctor Dr. Leroy Adams. So apparently, Dr. Leroy Adams, he had this. Of course, he was a politician. He was a senator elect. So he had this image of respectability, but he had been raping um, uh, Ruby McCollum, right? So Ruby McCollum had been he had treated her at some point, and so he had first raped her in her home. He was a physician, and he was known to provide, medical services to the needy. And so he had been treating her at one time, and during that time, he coerced, sexual relations from her. He raped her, and then she became pregnant and had a child for him. She didn't want to have the child when she was pregnant, but he refused to abort the child. He refused to help her abort the child. He was a medical doctor. She was a married woman. Uh, so he continued to have sexual relations with her, and eventually, he continues to, coerce sexual relations from her. So he continues to coerce sex from her through, of course, the Paramour rights. There was I did a feminist class, history of American women, right, in the 20th century when I was at Columbia. And one of the books we'd read was, about Black women who were often coerced into sex in the South. So this was very common in the South, even though there were these anti-miscegenation laws, during Jim Crow era. I'm talking about after slavery was abolished, during the Jim Crow era. It was very common when Black women went to work for white people. The white, um, the white boss, could coerce sex from her. so long as they were powerful without suffering any legal consequences. And there was nothing the black woman could do. In this case, however, Ruby McCollum was a wealthy black woman. She was the richest woman in Florida. But here she was, a public figure in Florida was raping her, right? So eventually she kills this guy, she shoots him, and she's arrested, and then it goes to trial. However, the case was already rigged against her because Judge Adams, ostensibly not related to the deceased Dr. C. Leroy Adams, he, however, was an honorary pallbearer, right, at his funeral, at the doctor's funeral. So you can see there's some bias already there. There's an element of bias, and then the jury was an all white jury in Florida, right? The jury was an all white jury, and the other thing is some members of the jury were actually had been patients of the doctor, right, Dr. Leroy Adams, whom um, Ruby McCollum was being charged for, you know, for his murder. So, the case was stacked against her. She had an attorney by the name of Frank Cannon, and this case is also notable because it was the first time that a black woman gave testimony in court, stating that a white man was the father of a child, and she talked about the abuses. She testified about the abuses of, the doctor whom she was alleged to have murdered, how he abused her, how he extorted sex from her, and how he was the father of her child. So, however, the Judge Adams, would tried to silence her, right? He's tried to silence her testimony to prevent her from revealing more details of the abuse. So even though her attorney, was very able, he protested, he kept trying to talk about, the abuses of the doctor, how he'd been violating her and abusing her and extorting sex from her, even though she was supposed to be a respectable married woman. Um, the the judge, uh the state attorney would protest, would oppose, oppose his the attempts of the criminal defense attorney, that's Miss McCollum's attorney. And eventually, the judge would rule in favor of the prosecutor, and he ended up silencing the testimony of, um, you know, Ruby McCollum, who was trying to give more details of, the victimization she suffered through the abuses of, uh, you know, Dr. Adams, whom she was alleged to have killed. Um, Interestingly, though, so ultimately she was convicted because it was an all white jury. And as I said earlier, upon appeal, the case was overturned by the Supreme Court of Florida because, for one, uh, the jury were sent to the scene of the crime, right, to examine the scene of the crime, but the judge didn't go with them, and the judge did not allow the defendants to go with them as well. So it was determined that that the judge had violated her civil rights. So the conviction was overturned, and uh, another trial was set. However, at some point, the her attorney now uh, pled insanity on her behalf, right? And so there was an examination, and it was determined that, that she was incompetent to stand trial, and so she was committed to the Florida State Mental Hospital, where she was until 1974, when the attorney Frank Cannon went on to he filed, her for her release under what's called the Baker's Act, right, in Florida. The Baker's Act, um, allows a mental patient to be released so long as they're not a danger to themselves or to others. So she was released and sent to a rest home, and you know, she stayed there, and she was transferred to another rehabilitation place. She was able to see her children again, and she eventually died at the age of 82 in 1992 from a stroke. Um so the 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 the, the, the case this the case it's it it garnered national attention, due to the efforts of Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston was a famous Harlem Renaissance writer. She's a female. Um, she's known for her works. I remember I'd studied some of her works. Um, uh, I think, did she write Their Eyes Were Watching God? I don't want to misstate, but I read her works. She graduated from Barnard. I think she was the first Black woman to graduate from Barnard College in New York, which is affiliated with Columbia University. So Zora Neale Hurston was somebody who was instrumental in bringing national attention to the case in Florida. So she had, at her expense, traveled down to Florida, and she had written. Of course, she was forced to sit in a segregated gallery because, the South was segregated during this time. This was a 1952, 1954 case. It was in the 1950s. So she sat in a segregated gallery, and at great expense to her, she was able to do some very great investigative reporting, and she published the details. She published the substance of her work in the Pittsburgh Courier, right, in a series of articles. Eventually, she couldn't make it to later uh, to the later cases because of she didn't have money for transportation, right? Which her experience also demonstrates the challenges that Black professionals faced in the um, during the Jim Crow era, and which Black professionals continue to face today. In fact, I'm going to do a video later on and talk about, you know, you know, professionals, Black professionals, female professionals as well, who suffered a lot tremendously during, at the risk of their lives, in trying to advance civil rights and their professional lives, uh, all the things that they risked, during the Jim Crow era. So that Zora Neale Hurston, didn't have money to be able to make it to the subsequent trials, and so, however, uh, as resourceful as she was, she decided to write um, very famous journalist and writer in the South who normally got into publishing controversial works. His name's William Bradford Huey. William Bradford Huey he was born in Alabama. He graduated from the University of Alabama. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa, and he was known for publishing works that were actually made into movies. He wrote books that were converted to Hollywood movies, which starred Julie Andrews, Tony Curtis, among many others. He published over 21 books, and with uh, over 30 million in book sales. So he was a very prominent journalist, and so she wrote him and tried to get his attention to get involved in the Ruby McCollum case. So it was a good thing that Zora Neale Hurston showed that support, not to leave this prominent, hapless Black woman, isolated and at the mercy of, the racist white power structure in Florida, in the South, in the Jim Crow South. And however, Judge Adams would impose a gag order, right? And because there were many complexities apart from the sordid details, the fact that, well, this politician, again, he was a senator elect, and he was said to be a gubernatorial prospect, that he had promise of becoming governor of Florida one day. That's the physician, Dr. Leroy Adams, um, who was actually who was coercing sex from one of from somebody he treated, right, and who act and also through the sexual assault, uh, fathered a child through her. That's through the woman who was alleged to be his murderer. So the Judge Adams, was trying to cover up, the salacious details, but at the same time, they said the reason he imposed a gag order, was that he was also trying to cover up the fact that, white power brokers in Florida and the South were involved in the illegal gambling business with black people. Now, something I didn't mention was Sam McCollum, right? Immediately after, it was his wife was arrested for the murder of the white doctor, Dr. Adams. Um, Sam McCullough was said to have taken his children, delivered them to his wife, to his mother-in-law, and they said, he suffered a heart attack. However, the undertaker claimed that it appears he intentionally overdosed uh, on his medication, because he knew he was destroyed. The killing, the murder of the doctor, of the white physician, would destroy him. So it turned out that, um, Sam McCullum, who, the wealthy, I don't know if to call him a black mobster, since he made money from gambling and illegal gambling activities. It turns out that the politician who had been killed, the physician who had this respectable, image in the society in Florida, was actually a business associate um, of the black of Ruby McCollum's husband. That's Sam McCollum, and so he was an investor, and he got proceeds from the illegal gambling activities of Sam McCollum. So this was part of what the judge, that's Judge Adams, was apparently trying to cover up by imposing the gag order. So there was a lot of corruption in Florida. The case, exposed a lot of corruption, and eventually William Bradford Huey would go down and try to get a story out of, but because of the imposed gag order, he couldn't see her when she was at the mental health hospital. He couldn't, and in fact, at some point, the judge found him in contempt of court. That's in violating the gag order, and he was jailed. He had to spend a night in jail for not paying the fine for the contempt violation. So this was a very interesting case, and fortunately for her, she was able to, she didn't suffer um, execution. She had to, unfortunately, she did have to live out in a substantial portion of her time, a life, almost 20 years, in a psychiatric hospital, where where she suffered the use of, excessive medication and electroshock therapy. And they said this affected her memory, so she couldn't, she suffered suppression of memory. And so eventually, when she was released, through the efforts of her attorney, Frank Cannon, she was released from the psychiatric hospital, the mental health hospital in Florida, and sent to a rest home. William Bradford Huey would establish a fund for her, which he provided $40,000 for her. It was supposed to be to purchase rights to uh, to a film, or a film or a book that was made. He wrote a book on, I think it was in 1964. It was first published in 1964 concerning her story, the Ruby McCollum story. He wrote a book on her, and there are several editions, and there have been several movies made concerning the story, because she was the first black woman. It's a landmark case. She was the first black woman to testify in court concerning the abuses of a white man, and that she had a child for a white man. This was in a criminal case. This was the first time this was done in America. Um, so she that's the case regarding Paramour rights. There's another interesting story. This was during the antebellum years, the era of slavery, of a woman called Celia. So I'm going to do a subsequent video and discuss that. A woman called Celia. She had killed her slave master, and I'm going to discuss that. A slave master through whom she had several children. He'd been forcing, raping her since she was 14 years old, and eventually she killed him. So I'm going to just do another video discussing Celia. It's a case that you're normally exposed to in law school. If you're interested in race relations and critical race theory courses in law school. But again, the case of Ruby McCollum, it's kind of like sad, uh, you know, but at least she wasn't executed, and she still ended up living to 82 years old, or even though she lived without her memory. Um, so I'll stop this video here and do a subsequent video discussing Celia. My name is Oluro Timiosha. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.